Let me welcome you back to this second part of our morning lectureship to enjoy the response and then to engage in a discussion, fielding your questions. Let me begin by introducing to you our respondent. It is a privilege for me to introduce our president, Dr. Mark Labberton, who assumed his responsibilities as the 5th president of Fuller Seminary on July 1, 2013. Dr. Labberton's educational pedigree has led him for a BA from Whitman College, MDiv at Fuller Seminary, and PhD at Cambridge University. And he has served in the previous 4 years as the Lloyd John Ogilvie Professor of Preaching and the Director of the Ogilvie Institute of Preaching, in conjunction with which he was also the founder of the well-known Micah groups. Dr. Labberton came to Fuller after several decades of significant involvement in pastoral and denominational ministry as an ordained pastor of the Presbyterian Church USA, as well as an extensive involvement in national and international organizations. He co-founded the Christian International Scholarship Foundation, an organization funding the advanced theological education of Christian leaders from the majority world. He has also worked closely with John Stott Ministries and the Langham Partners International, and he serves as a senior fellow of the International Justice Mission. He is someone who clearly sees, and I certainly have experienced that, the issues of justice and faith as intimately intertwined, both at the local and the global levels. And this is clearly reflected in his publications, which I commend to you, are on the table at the back. The Dangerous Act of Loving Your Neighbor, Seeing Others Through the Eyes of Jesus, and The Dangerous Act of Worship, Living God's Call to Justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Labberton, our distinguished respondent.
This is apparently going to be a 3-bottle response, so I'm looking forward to that. It's not McCormick and Schmick's, but it will do. Let me begin by just saying how truly grateful I am, Miroslav, that you are here and for the honor of having you here. Your life and your writing has meant a great deal to me personally and has been the source of tremendous challenge and fascination. I think partly it's biographical and the work that you've done that has so deeply integrated your own particular narrative, and the story that is mapped against that of change in Eastern Europe and around the world is really enormous. My life, I think, was really particularly changed by 2 of your books. First, certainly Exclusion and Embrace, but also The End of Memory, which for me was one of the most important books that I've read in many, many years. So I'm extremely grateful for both of those 2 things. It's funny to have an opportunity to do this because the first time that I ever had an opportunity to share in a certain way a platform with Miroslav happened at a National InterVarsity Graduate Student Conference where I had spoken, and Miroslav was going to be a respondent to the final address, and just before that happened, he had to leave, and with 3 minutes notice, I was asked to step in as the respondent to the lecture that was just about to be done. It was literally closing, and suddenly I'm supposed to step in and be a respondent. On this particular occasion, it didn't happen that there was any explanation of the fact that I was just stepping in to do this, so it felt a little awkward to me when I got up to the platform to do so. Marva Dawn had been speaking there. Marva's a marvelous speaker, and one of the stylistic things that she did was to suddenly intone in plain song various texts that she was going to then expound upon in her address, and this had been the source of some amusement, especially among students that knew nothing about plain song and couldn't quite figure out why this woman was suddenly just singing in what they understood to be a monotone, a text in various ways. So I got up and I said, you know, it's a great honor to have an opportunity to respond to the person who had just spoken. But in the spirit of Marva Dawn, I feel compelled to begin with a text in the same way that she began with a text, and this is my text. I have no idea what I'm going to say. And here's what's more, I can't believe I'm standing in for Miroslav Volf. Amen. And then I said, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you. And they responded, thank you. This topic is an extremely important one for many reasons, and it was practically brought home to me this morning because just before this event, I attended the Pasadena Mayor's Prayer Breakfast. This is an event which apparently traditionally has been a rather evangelically flavored event and very decidedly Christian only. But this year, it became a multi-faith experience, and there were representatives from Jewish faith, there were representatives from Islamic faith, and there were many others who were present in the room, all of which were not only just acknowledged, but really incorporated into the program. It simply, in a very pragmatic way, expressed something of the flavor of the world in which we live and the importance of these issues. One of the things that I have loved about what you've done this morning, and it feels a bit like you're just sort of taking a breath before, in a way, the major presentation of tomorrow that brings all of what you've said today into conversation with globalization, is that it expresses that in a world of such teeming difference and such profound values and perspectives owned by these world faiths, that in fact it's just extremely important that we take seriously the complicated challenge that it is and to find some way by which to negotiate the challenge. What I think you've outlined this morning in a very descriptive way is simply the experience of, in a way, laying out a kind of architecture for how world faiths could be understood. And the 6 examples that you gave of these 6 qualities which are shared in common are a kind of major architecture within which the practices of faith in any given house of faith end up being lived out. And it's in that large architecture that I think what you've pointed to in these 6 characteristics of world faiths, I think is given tremendous help. I've never heard this particular list, but lists like this that are trying to describe not some kind of common core, as you said, but instead a kind of environment of expression and commitment which we share through these points of this architecture, I think is a very, very helpful tool. It is, as you say in the manuscript, a bit like preparing a big table in which there's an opportunity to be able to bring what you bring quite distinctively as a person that comes from a particular tradition with these 6 points, for example, in the context of the Christian faith, and to invite others to do likewise, owning your own tradition while engaging in a project which has elements that are common to the enterprise that you all share. And I think that's a very, very helpful thing. It's not to try to create some sort of great religious soup or stew. That's not at all what you're suggesting. It's not to draw lines or boundaries in order to create defenses either. It's rather, I think, to indicate what is possible and honoring to our own tradition while pursuing a way of diminishing hostility and violence and misunderstanding, if not also war. So what I find helpful about your effort is to suggest a way of holding even our quite different accounts of what is true, and as you say, that's an extremely important debate and set of concerns, what is true and good while remaining or growing in our close contact with one another. This is the challenge. How do we remain distinctly and truly ourselves and engage in a non-hostile, non-violent way with our neighbors in contexts in which that challenge is going to be fraught with all kinds of difficulties? I've appreciated very much this sort of galvanizing theme out of the Christian tradition that we do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And the particular way in which we understand the relationship between the transcendent and the mundane is obviously pertinent to all of that. The question, I think, that it raises for me that I want to just explore a bit is, in light of this architecture, where is the architecture placed? This is, it seems to me, is part of where the argument and the issues become increasingly complex. The architecture itself, of course, is by no means just theoretical. It's related to places and times and people and traditions. But in another sense, it plays out in very specific contexts. And it's in those contexts where this architecture certainly becomes clearly no longer just an enterprise of very thoughtful and important reflection, but a place of collision. I think, for example, in places that I've visited, where there is a hostility of architecture between faiths, you could start in Jerusalem and go from there in physical manifestations in which the architecture of the faith actually intersects with and is built on, over, under, with, beside, against other architectures. And that's where the analogy of coming to the table seems right, but as you know far better than I do, that table is anything but a clean and smooth table. It's fraught and often chaotic. These are the places, it seems to me, where the challenges come and where you're going to move tomorrow, I'm sure, with issues of globalization, is the fact that these things end up only raising the bar and the challenge of engagement, I think, even more. One of the things that many secularists would suggest is that you can't really talk about religion in today's world without almost automatically feeling as though you have put a placard of bigotry across your forehead. The very nature of making a religious claim seems to suggest to the minds of many secularists, and even some of other faiths, that if you, in fact, make a religious claim, erect your architecture, and make an affirmation of its importance, that the claim of bigotry is immediately on the table. The suggestion that anyone dare make any claim, and that that claim should somehow be respected, may be legitimate in a kind of postmodern way, but in any personal terms, it easily starts encroaching on the sense that you're being pushed against by the people and the institutions and the places, the ideas, and particularly the religious institutions that are around you. I admire deeply and applaud and want to encourage anything and everything that you're doing that has to do with bridge making. And the significance of that is, to me, the large enterprise that you're engaged with. I want to just ask, as that bridge is built, for whom is it built? And how does it get crossed by ordinary people whose intellectual structures and whose patterns of life don't begin with these 6 qualities, but begin in a very much more mundane context. This is, of course, again, as you know, better than most in the room, that is where the rub actually comes. So the architecture seems extremely important. It seems useful. It could be contested, but I think broadly speaking, it seems to me that you're giving us very helpful handles on how to approach that level of conversation. But the question that it raises for me is the question, what would it require of self-conscious, self-critical Christian believers to live into that architecture and to make use of that architecture in the context of the interaction that occurs with people of other faiths and with other faith ideas? If ordinary life, as globalization makes so clear and modernism makes so clear, is really so important, then let me just reflect for a moment about some of the ordinary life dimensions of this architecture, which I think make working out its implications particularly fraught. And again, I'm just naming perhaps what we might know, but it seems to me nevertheless valuable to bring it to the conversation. To have traction with this architecture seems to me to need to then consider several other concerns. The first is the role of passion in religious faith. One of the things that I think is so profound about my own experiences in various parts of the world and experiences of multi-faith in this country as well is the way in which religious devotion and commitment, world faiths or local faiths, are filled with deep, amorphous, profound passion. It attaches to a level of emotion and reflection and commitment and devotion, which just makes the image of a table of conversation so difficult to imagine, because you come to the table already so laden with a passion of your own tradition and your own religious experience. I think, for example, of a time when, in a very unusual way, I happened to be traveling on a highway that had been closed in Bangladesh because of an enormous Muslim festival that was occurring. There were 1 million people in prayer, all dressed in white, all responding to the person who was giving direction, and stretched out across the highway and across many, many, many fields. There was, according to the Dhaka newspaper, 1 million people at this festival on that particular day. And at a particular moment, when everyone was face down, kneeling in prayer, they opened the road so that the car that I was in and the several other cars that were driving could pass through this field. It was an unforgettable moment of literally driving through religious devotion, where in this image, this sea of all of these people, there was a deep sense of their responsiveness, a crowd of 1 million, utterly silent in that particular moment, and then us driving through. It was a moment of feeling and seeing what I've seen in much less dramatic crowds, of the depth of religious devotion, where people in some cases had walked days in order to be there, to express the significance of their impact. And therefore, the architecture feels, to many, I would fear, a remote and distant fact that is disconnected from the practice of their faith in ways that would be difficult to integrate. Is this not also, of course, very much a part of the response that we've seen in recent days, whether we're thinking of the World Vision controversy or whether we're thinking of other controversies that have occurred in recent days, where the social media hypes the nature of this conversation so much that the possibility of even acknowledging that there is an architecture, that there may be commonalities, just seems almost impossible in many cases to actually arrive at. The second thing is, in addition to the place and consideration of passion, is the place of power. It seems to me to imply, perhaps, that to work this architecture in a meaningful way implies a maturity that it seems to me would be uncommon for many, not least in relationship to issues of power. So much about our human experience is shaped simply by our own experiences and placements of power, our sense of power or powerlessness. This is the nature of what causes religious devotion for many, and it's also one of the things that most clearly underlines the significance of how power is understood and negotiated in each of the various world faiths. This is where I get very nervous for the trajectory of how conversations around world religions and world faiths and globalization can actually interact. I think that you are asking for each tradition, in the best sense, to live up to its best use of power. That's how I would understand the architecture. That's the right way for such architecture to be presented. But when I stood in Hebron, as I did a few months ago, feeling the intersection in collision and anger and hostility between Jews and Muslims and Christians, it was a collision of power. The architecture, in that case, again, physical, which was also political and which was also religious and theological, was a power collision that you could find at any of the checkpoints in that small town. It was, for me, a little microcosm of the difficulty of the challenge, also its urgency, but the question of how the framework that you've suggested and the questions of power get negotiated, it seems to me, is really extremely important. How do we move from one to the other in a way that's going to somehow give it a fair account and a respect and deference, in which we hold our power open-handedly without abandoning our tradition or our truth claims? Those are just complicated issues that are part of that rich debate that you referred to. Thirdly, and related really to the first two, is the place of fear. So in addition to the place of passion, the place of power, I think the other thing that makes the table so complicated and messy is the place of fear. Fear in part simply because of history. Fear because of the way in which this long-standing collision has already been so vigorously played out, so we don't come to the table neutrally. Clearly, your own narrative has made that evident. What is so striking about your narrative is your willingness to deeply move into its significance, to allow the theological and spiritual questions that it has raised to be nurtured, reflected upon, developed, and maturing in your own life, and to call us into that same exercise. That's part, at least, of how I engage your reading. I'm so grateful for that. But it just is also a diagnostic description to say that is a very unusual thing. And therefore, the question of how it is that we negotiate the table in the context of such fear. So if we could acknowledge the architecture, passion is at the table, power and its complexities are at the table, and an enormous amount of fear is at the table. At a level that I would sense would be so high, I'm not sure that many ordinary Christians would see the connection that I think you're trying to point toward in finding this commonality of architecture while acknowledging, nevertheless, the distinction of each of our faiths. So it leads me to simply ask, in the midst of this, finally, what is the place of love in this paradigm? It's at the core, in particular, of the Christian tradition. I would want to speak only at the moment out of that. And to say that whatever it is that this negotiating process and this conversation is about, it must, in the end, be an experience and an expression of what the Scriptures say is the character of God's great, extraordinary, and gracious love. How does that inform, guide, shape, challenge, enable us to move from this architecture to the reality? Let me close with this one story. When I was a pastor in Berkeley, there were perpetual demonstrations, of course, in Berkeley. That was part of the spirit of the place. And there was a period when there had been 2 weeks of demonstrations on Sproul Plaza, the main plaza of the University of California, which were held forth under the title of the Anti-Islamo-Fascist Celebration. You can imagine there was a lot of passion, that there was a lot of power, there was a lot of fear, and there was very little love on the plaza of those 2 weeks. At the very end of this week of hostility that was mostly between Jews and Muslims, there was a woman, a Christian student that was part of our church and part of the wider fellowship of other Christian groups on campus, who had been very deeply immersed in this, believing that as a Christian, she needed to be exactly in the middle of the anti-Islamo-fascist week as a person that was seeking to both learn, engage, and serve what was clearly a very hostile and difficult table where the combination of factors made the uproar of those 2 weeks very, very intense. After the week was out, on the final day, something occurred which was described the following Monday morning by the rather cynical, anti-religious editor of the Daily Cal, the University of California newspaper. And it provokes me, as it did when I first read it, to just ask again about, in addition to the place of passion, power, and fear, about the place of love. And the convergence for her and for some that day came about in this way. This is how the editor wrote it. I conclude all of this, his summary, that is, of this anti-Islamo-fascist celebration. I conclude this by ceding the floor to my friend Tinley Ireland, who gave, for my money at least, the best speech of the evening. Just as the sun set, shining right into her face, she stood up on the steps of Sproul Hall on that same consecrated spot where earlier in the day and throughout the last 2 weeks, the fear-based communities had shouted themselves hoarse about the people over there who are just waiting to get us. She stood there and she told us about her faith. She talked about how the hardest part of following Jesus Christ was to love, and to love not just her friends, but also her enemies, to stop having enemies. At the end, she asked everyone in the crowd who did not believe in Jesus as the Son of God to please raise their hand. Almost every hand, as far as I could see, went up, rejecting her central claim. My own, he said, went up. She smiled. And as the light faded, she simply and truly looked at us and said, "I love you." He goes on, "I've been on the receiving end of a few punches in my life, but nothing ever hit me that hard. I don't know exactly what kind of politics or religion or philosophy that is, but whatever that is, where can I sign up?"
We will now give Dr. Volf an opportunity to respond to the questions, the presentation, and then we will open it up for questions to you.
So where can we sign up?
Right here.
Here we go. Altar call is here. Yeah.
The buses are waiting.
Yeah. Thank you for this response, for the questions. I think they're touched the very heart of what I was after, and in some ways point to kind of places where it will either succeed or it will fail, and succeed and fail not simply at an intellectual level of construction of a proposal, but succeed and fail at the level of lived lives and practices of people in everyday kinds of environments. So what partly drives what I was trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is a prevalent sense that you articulated, and I think one of your early comments about religious faith and bigotry. And more than just bigotry, somehow sinister character of religious faith is being assumed. That is to say, more you give yourself to faith, the less likely you're going to be able to contribute anything to the common good, especially in the good understood as common with those who disagree with you, who have other kinds of faiths than you do. And my sense is that actually this is quite mistaken, that deeper immersion into not just the Christian faith, but also other faiths, in fact, will help lead or redeem, so to speak, the religion, the faiths, from multiple captivities in which they find themselves. Again, I'm not leveling religions. As I said, I'm a Trinitarian Christian of a certain stripe, and I'm happily so, and ready to contend for the truth of the faith, right? And truth is very important to me in this whole thing. But nonetheless, even so, I think that the major causes of religious conflicts are not religious. I think they're economic and political. And I think the kind of construction of faith in such a way that it aligns itself easily with certain kinds of political causes and certain kinds of worldly goods that we pursue is the most significant factor contributing to the bigotry and to the negative effects that faiths have in the world today. And that's true of the Christian faith. I think that's true also of other faiths as well. And one of my goals was then to indicate that it is this actually two worlds account of reality, our very significant contribution to the world peace, if you want, if that's what we are interested in, apart from the question of truth. And it's significant because it relativizes the struggle for the worldly goods. For instance, it makes such virtue as contentment much more possible. We live in a world, I will talk about it tomorrow a bit, we live in the world of impossible contentment. We all know we should be content, but we have no idea how to be content, and when we think that we are content, we fear that we are losing something really significant, right? And so we're malcontent about our struggle to being content because we've been brainwashed, no, I don't know whether that's the right term, we've been habituated into thinking in certain kinds of patterns in terms of what we need and what progress means and what our flourishing means. I think world faiths have an important contribution to make in this regard. Also in regard to relationship between faith and political realm and nation. Worse for the faiths, I think, is association with political power. And a good deal of violence can be ascribed to this. So that's roughly where I'm trying to head with it. Obviously, there are many constraints that need to be placed on faith so that they can proceed in the manner which I am suggesting. And I think two major ones is I think the freedom of religion, freedom of faith, has to be there. And some people say, well, this is a Christian kind of invention, and I think Christians have proudly emphasized freedom of faith from the very beginning. But I think it's characteristic also in important ways of all world faiths. All of them are at the center, and this is was the whole point of world faiths addressing individuals, not members of a particular group. Addressing individual means that it presupposes that each individual has responsibility for the general direction of their life. And that responsibility is a presupposition, a possibility of the world faith, and therefore must be affirmed by every world faith. And if you add to that a golden rule, which I think most faiths, in one way or the other, maybe silver rule or whatever else you can describe this, there are varieties of versions, stronger or weaker of this, but roughly they end up going in the same direction. Some form of golden rule combined with this sense of freedom, I think also is part and parcel of those world religions. That makes it much more possible to imagine then how a conversation between them can take place. But then your really important questions come after this. And those are the questions of passion, those are the questions of power, questions of fear, and then ultimately of the kinds of love that we exercise. And maybe all three previous ones are summed up in the question of love. And I'm thinking when I read this passion or desire or power, fear and love, I'm thinking of Augustine. Right? It's kind of Augustinian sense that our loves are those that determine the kinds of lives we'll lead and how we will relate to others. I think religions are dangerous because they are not simply intellectual edifices, because they are lodged in the depths of our hearts, but they also give us potential because of that, right? They're just because of that able to transform realities. And I'm thinking, globalization processes, I won't have too much time to talk about this, but globalization itself needs taming. It needs framing and taming, needs curtailing. Who is and how it is going to be done. You can't do it with head knowledge alone. You have to do it with something that shapes practices, motivates kinds of passions, and establishes communities of action. And so I think schooling of desire is what I would think that world faiths are. Certainly Christian faith is as well. Clearly, this is, again, kind of ideal case scenario, or I am looking at potential that world faiths have and not the misuses. I'm aware of those as well. Fear, for instance, also. It was brought to my attention when I was walking with a friend of mine in the streets of Sarajevo, and it was after the war, and mosques were popping up in Sarajevo, and he's a Franciscan monk. And he told me, Miroslav, you know, this is not about religion, these mosques. This is about fear. This is about marking territory. This is ours, and the mosque proves that it is ours. And then he said, we fear each other. Because Christians are doing the same thing, just 100 kilometers down south in Mostar. There's this huge, humongous cross that was placed on the top of a mountain. And it's the same mountain from which Serbs have shelled Mostar, right? And now instead of weapons of war, there's a weapon of the cross standing there and kind of dominating the whole landscape, right? It's marking territory. It's not worshiping crucified. It's marking territory, right? And why do we mark territory? He said, we mark territory because we fear each other and we do not fear God. Again, the primacy of the transcendent over against the kind of the mundane and relativizing of kind of the mundane relationship that we have, which comes actually then to the good of these very relationships themselves. And that partly also attends to the question of an issue of power. There is power in the blood, right? We sing. And there is an incredible power in that love of the enemy, which was instantiated in that best of the speeches to which you referred. There is power in marginality, but there is power in kind of masses mobilized around some goal. And I think we have to thematize those and reflect about deployment of power as religious folks. How it is that in the context of contested spaces with power coursing in different directions and stronger and weaker facing each other, how it is that we as religious people, we as Christians, can deploy power in responsible way. There's no way of going away from power. There's only a way of properly deploying power and the right kind of power. So those are some of you, in response to your challenges, those are some of the challenges that I see and I, in a way, in a broader project, I try to attend to. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. We are now going to open it to you, and we do have a mic in the front here, and I would ask you to come up and put your question into that mic. And because of the size of this sanctuary, it might be good if those of you who intend to pose some questions to queue up, at least in a few numbers at a time, so we can be efficient with our use of time here. So please, would you please identify yourself briefly and then pose your question?
My name is Oscar Owens from West Angeles, Church of God in Christ. I have enjoyed all of the presentations this morning. Let me ask you a question, Dr. Volf. You talked about how all religions, world religions, address the issue of the ordinary life, even when we have transcendent concerns. How do we legitimately, as various religious groups, define and talk about a commons, the common concerns of us as communities? Is there a way to continuously talk about that and interact about that for the benefit of better ordinary life, or must we continually be relegated to choosing transcendence and forgetting about the common life, or engage in creating a commons that we can agree upon even though we have differing views about what that might mean?
Yeah, that's what I try to express with the sense that various world religions are concerned. A kind of integral part of them is a concern for ordinary life, and given their universal scope and principle of reversibility, which is expressed in the Golden Rule, there is also, I think, embedded a concern for a kind of common spaces and shared aspects of not simply individually pursued, but common spaces and common goods that we need to pursue. Of course, those common goods will be contested. That, if I understand correctly, what the contestations among world religions are, rarely are there, occasionally they are about theological issues. And even when they're about theological issues, they are about kind of legs on the ground effects of those theological issues. And my sense is that if there are those commonalities among faiths, I think it makes negotiation of what is common to us much more possible. I don't think it solves things. I think it simply provides a framework for negotiation. I don't think we can resolve the issue of life together without conflictual character. I think conflict is embedded in the very character of human interaction. It happens in my living room all the time between my boys and myself. That's fine, right? We don't necessarily, and it's sometimes actually very good. Were there not a pushback against me as a father by my teenage son, I might have not been as good of a human being. If that weren't the case, right? So I think the contestations themselves are, okay, we need to figure out how to pursue them, and I'm hoping that we can have a framework even though, or rather just because, also because we advocate and espouse different religions.
Understanding that I think human conflict is, with us, but it seems to me that we seem to be talking around the margins, and that is, isn't there a fundamental issue that separates religions, and that is human dignity derived from God or derived from your belief system? And I have societies which treat people of different religion differently because they do not acknowledge that all individuals are made in the image and likeness of God, regardless of what you're believing in. And the minute you have your religious belief system as a criteria for human dignity, you will never solve any problem.
So you're referring, I presume, to John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Colony?
Sure. Or the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is Wahhabis, but I think as Americans, maybe the first thing should come John Winthrop.
Oh, absolutely.
And then one realizes, right, that actually the contrast between our beliefs in God may not be such great. A lot of people I hear make the argument like that, say, well, Christians have this inherent dignity, but Wahhabi Muslims or Muslims don't, right? And I don't think that's quite right. And so my sense is that you have variety of religions that in their own way can assert the dignity, and reason where it lies grounded, I think, in this fundamental sense that each individual person has a responsibility for the direction of their lives, so that kind of a religious freedom that's an endemic in all world faiths, structurally, I think, not always lived as such. For instance, for centuries in Christian tradition, absolutely not lived as a religious faith, right? You have to think that it took Catholic Church until the 60s of last century to embrace idea of religious freedom, right? So religious freedom has been contested for so many years, but I do think that it's kind of endemic to the character of religions, and therefore also the idea of dignity of individual human being.
Well, but I think even at that point, I mean, if it takes you 1965 years to figure something out, it's not embedded. And that it's this sense of, and it's part in my tradition of a baptismal vow that we respect the dignity of every human being, totally apart from religion. And I think that's the key, is that if dignity is in any way hinged by belief system, you'll always be fighting because you create the other, always, if dignity is self-derived.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you might, right? But I'm not sure how else you could identify dignity unless via a belief system. I do not think that I have dignity because I have certain beliefs, right? I have a dignity because God created human beings in God's image. And whatever belief system you have, this is where your dignity lies. But for me to justify dignity of human beings, I've already invoked a religious belief, right? So it's possible that different religions might have different ways of justifying human dignity, but actually, in fact, the dignity from my perspective of every human being is rooted in the sheer fact that we have been created by God as those in the image of God.
Thank you.
Your lecture and your response, Dr. Lambert, tonight, that was very enlightening. Several years ago, my wife and I spent some time in Nepal, and we were visiting a holy site, a stupa, and a prayer site, and I was approached by a Buddhist evangelist, the young man quoted himself being, and he wanted to share with me the claims of Buddhism because he felt as though it would be appropriate for my life as a Christian, so I could remain a Christian and hold to Buddhist beliefs. And this idea, though, hit me as this morning I'm listening to both of you, and I realized the claim of Jesus, though, at Matthew 28, the Great Commission, calling us to lead people to discipleship in Jesus Christ. And so now when I think of the discussion both of you are bringing up, interacting, building bridges, but to what purpose? Is it to bring people to a knowledge of Jesus Christ and salvation? Or is it simply to, which would be a good thing, to build bridges of friendship? I'm not saying that's bad or anything, but I just wonder, how does that interact with our calling as Christian believers?
I think it connects really well, at least for me. I don't see in anything that I've said, I don't see anything that would call into question the Great Commission to bear witness to Jesus Christ. I think in some ways, kind of two steps removed, what I do here is bearing witness to Jesus Christ. Not directly, but indirectly. And I think that, that's inherent in the character of the Christian faith. So it is in Buddhist faith, by the way, right? But it's inherent in the character of the Christian faith. And we ought to cheerfully bear witness to this amazing fact that in Jesus Christ, God has come and revealed God's own being to us as an unconditional love. What can be better in the world than that? You know, put me in front of people, I'll evangelize, no problem. I love it.
Yeah, I see them as part and parcel of the same thing. They are different parts of the conversation, but I think they're for a Christian, I think it's one conversation. It's dependent on which audience and at what stage of the conversation are you engaged. I think that's the variation rather than a different purpose or a colliding purpose or a forgetful purpose.
Thank you.
Dr. Volf, in your lecture, you referred to several occasions on the other religions also adapting or incorporating democracy. Also, you referred to the idea of religious freedom. And also, a previous questioner talked about human dignity. These are, I think, the important terms in global society because these are, in a sense, public languages. So my question is, in a way, the way you describe religion world religion has a unique understanding of transcendence and mundane reality. But I believe each religion has a different development or self-understanding, even capacity, how to relate transcendence and mundane in public realm. Because public realm is not just private, mundane realm. When that third realm or mediating realm, that public realm, is not fully developed theologically, also within religious community, I think religious people make all kinds of mistakes. That is, either they just escaping to the otherworldly world, taking just transcendence as the total reality, or they just trying to bring transcendence to the world using their own power or theocratic approach. So in my observation, that's the area, going back to Dr. Leviton's approach, that fear and power, passions infiltrate. So my question is for religions to approach those categories, democracy, human dignity, human rights, how we Christians help develop, on the one hand, public theology, on the other hand, public virtue. How can we encourage Christians, to be both Christians and citizens together in global society? I think that's the first task we need to engage before we talk to other religions.
Me?
That was yours.
That was mine, okay. Yeah, so where I see it is that the basic distinction is transcendent and mundane, or this worldly. Within mundane, there are varieties of spheres of life, you might say. There is a private realm, there is a communal realm, there is a public realm, or a variety of publics. And I do think that religions, Christian faith certainly, has developed varieties of ways in which to address those individual spheres. And they need to be all properly addressed. And I agree with you that especially relationship between, within religion, relationship between transcendent realm and the rule, that is to say state, and public realm in that sense, is a very crucial one. I'll try to address that in my lecture tomorrow. Yeah, that is much.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, and if we can keep our questions brief and be able to accommodate all of you who still have some. Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Jillian Granum. I'm a student here at Fuller. I'm really interested in what you were saying about the role of human dignity and particularly the role of democracy in religions. And it seems that, particularly in thinking about women, many religions have not as only part of their practice, but it seems very deeply embedded in their theology, a secondary role for women. And so I'd like to ask you if you could speak to that, and particularly in relating that to the idea of democracy.
Yeah, I think women, yeah. All world faiths, all faiths in general, which is to say all human systems that we've had for quite a long time have not been equally friendly to men and women, right? So my question is more this: do world faiths have a potential for inner transformation so that the equal dignity of all human beings can be, therefore also men and women, can be respected on the grounds of that faith itself? And I need to then distinguish between what one might describe the inner logic of faith and varieties of expression that it finds throughout its history, but also in some of its sacred writings. We make that distinction, obviously, when it comes to the Christian faith. There are statements in the Old Testament, there are statements in the New Testament that are not particularly egalitarian, and we're all aware of those. And hermeneutical challenge for us was to interpret properly those passages in conjunction with others, but also in conjunction with a kind of reading of the logic of the faith itself that's faithful to the character of faith. Now, my contention would be that world faiths, just like Christian faith, had this potential of redeeming fully its possibilities with regard to equality of women, just like Christianity had, so also other faiths have as well. Obviously, that can be contested, and you'll find in the Christian side of things and another faith side of things people who will push either way. I'm hoping, I'm betting that I'm right.
Okay. Thank you. We'll accommodate the 4 questioners that are standing there, and then we will draw to a conclusion. Thank you. Jeff, please.
Thank you to both of you. Brief question, wondering, the observation would be that Dr. Labberton's points all pointed to characteristics that can be thought of individually. You talk about world religion as touching the individual, and so even though we wouldn't want to trap it in individualism that we see in the West, the observation would be that some of these issues have to do with the individual's sense of self and sense of belonging to the right group, etc. The question would relate to this. I still think we live in a world where the United States is confused with Christianity. To some extent, certainly in the Arabic world, I believe Israel is confused with Judaism. And I'm wondering if you could address the extent to which any type of thinking about world peace could address that confusion, which I believe has wreaked havoc in many ways.
I'll do so tomorrow. Is that
Thank
good?
you very much. Thank you for standing.
It's a very important issue, indeed, a crucial one. Yeah.
Good morning, Drs. Volf and Labberton. Mark Burns, Manitou Press. Dr. Volf, you emphasized that all religions, including Christianity, have a component of personal or individual responsibility. And Dr. Labberton, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds as if you're pointing out practical roadblocks to implementing an architecture as you have created, Dr. Volf. And I'm wondering if it's possible from either of your perspective that such an individualized concept of religious identity may not, in fact, be a barrier that keeps an architecture that could be so fruitful from being practically implemented. Does that question make sense? In other words,
Can you say the last sentence one more time?
does such an individualized religious identity that has as a primary component personal responsibility rather than communal identity itself, practically speaking, in terms of implementation, an obstacle for an architecture such as you suggest being fruitful?
I think that part of what I was trying to get at was not so much an individual expression of those things, although it certainly plays out in those terms, but really a marker that could just as truly be said, those 4 questions that I was raising belong just as much to a community as they do to a set of individuals. But to ask your question, or to try to respond to your question, do I think individualism, as we practice it, ends up becoming a roadblock to this architecture or many other such architectures of attempting to try to understand what peace and justice mean in the world? Absolutely. And that pervades cultures and human experience, tribes and religions all over the place. So yes, I do think that that's a roadblock, and I do think that it requires a willingness to grow in maturity and in identity with a community that's much greater than we are typically prepared to actually do, especially, I think, in the West.
My sense would be also that addressing an individual, which is what I said that world faiths do, could be taken in individualistic ways. And indeed, we can give examples of individualist forms of religiosity, right? But need not be taken. And we can also point to much more communal forms of religiosity, both in terms of how individual is being nurtured to make that fundamental decision, but also into what that decision is, what kind of community that decision is being made, right? And so I don't think that responsibility for my life as an individual, I mean, I die, nobody can die for me. Nobody can be born for me. Nobody can set the direction of my entire life for me, right? That is not individualism in my understanding. That's a part of human condition, and we can see that either, we can construe this either as being inserted into a community, supported by a community, or we can take it simply as kind of naked individualism who subsequently goes into the community. So I guess that's what I would differentiate between the types of relationship that transcendent realm has to the individual from individualism as we exercise it in certain domains of life.
Thank you.
Dr. Lamberton, Dr. Volf, my name is Carlos Robles, and the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. And everybody
And with
here
you
this
too.
year. I'm a pastor in Walnut, and Dr. Volf, correct me if I'm wrong, but what would you say to someone that, I was challenged by one of your statements, I could be wrong, this is what I heard, that the problem of religion is not so much, it's not so much a problem of truth or religion, but it's more political and economic. I think that's what I heard you say. But if economic and political issues are man-made, and I look back to Genesis where God set the terms of faith and acceptance before him as one is faith, and you see without politics, without economics, the first murder and man committing violence against his brother, and where they take issue at that it's not at the root truth and who Jesus Christ is. The Jews crucified Christ because of his claim, and the Muslims, as far as I understand, they do not believe that he's the Son of God or that he rose from the dead or that he even died on the cross. So what would you say to someone that says, I don't think it's political or economic at the root?
Well, you know, I don't know what the root is, right? Unless you say the root is human captivity to sin, right? But what the concrete, situationally defined root of the conflicts are, my sense would be, they're not monocausal. They're not monocausal. It's neither just politics, neither just religion, nor culture, economics. It's multiple forces together. My point is that If you simply separate religion from particular interests, I think you will misunderstand what's going on. You'll misunderstand also why Cain killed his brother Abel, if you think of it simply in religious terms. That's not to say the truth of faith is not important. To me, it is. But it's to recognize also that often those who have the truth of faith are capable and have historically committed quite significant atrocities.
Yes.
So,
but you're not leveling all religions, are you?
no, I'm not. I'm not actually. No, see, what I'm saying is that all religions make claims to truth. I think that Jesus Christ is the incarnation of God, and therefore that the truth of humanity actually is expressed in the God incarnate, who is Jesus Christ. As I said, I believe in the Holy Trinity. I believe in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Once you do that, everything's, you got to swallow the whole thing.
Thank you. And we'll take our last question. Thanks.
Thank you, doctors. My name is Guillermo Pupo. I'm a student here at Fuller. And the question is for either or both of you. I will use Dr. Laverton's analogy of architecture. And if we're saying that these 6 commonalities of world religions may be the pillars for negotiation and conversations, my question to you is, how do you see the role of worship as a platform or ground for spiritual progress to facilitate a conversation between these religions?
Yeah, worship is a particularly complicated question. I think Mark is going to be able to say more about this than I am. But I don't think that conversations are just conversations of the kind that we are having here around this table. I think conversations with common engagement. I think conversations are around common projects. Conversations around common practices, all sorts of things of that sort are also important, as are more intellectual, theological conversations that happen. Go with, as we have done when we organized the Common Word Conference with some of the leading Muslim clerics, go picking fruit in the orchards around Guildford. And you've got a great opportunity for doing something commonly, sharing common humanity in reaching for something that's sustaining all of us, and also opening oneself for understanding the other person, and also implicitly for conversations about more theological or philosophical or ethical types of issues. I think the same can be said of a particular worship practices, though I want to be very sensitive about worship spaces, what is implied in them, and I think I'd defer to Mark to say something about those things.
Who would now like to defer to Todd Johnson, but I will say something. I would understand worship to be our expression of response to our ultimate reality claims, right? Whatever it is that we are claiming is supremely true. And our response to that is what we would call a life or an act of worship. It takes so many different manifestations, and it's absolutely true that it is around those places, those buildings, those sites, those practices, that some of the greatest religious hostility actually exists, and the greatest misunderstanding actually exists. So what I would say is that in the context of this morning's conversation, it's actually sometimes having opportunity to engage with one another in issues and practices of worship where we begin to actually understand the nature of what's really being claimed by the other person in a way that we may not if we stand simply outside it and think of it just as a sort of theoretical structure, as opposed to a response of a person's life or a community's life. So I think actually engaging there can clarify, and I think the architecture that Dr. Volf was recommending or suggesting is one that we can use to actually help us understand and even unpack what it is that we're seeing and what our response to that will be. There will be places where that collision will be real, and then the question becomes, what do we do out of that? And I would, as a Christian, I would simply hope that one of the things that it would do is that it would lead us to even deeper, more loving and genuine engagement, as opposed to either ideological hostility or a rejection of the other because they don't actually share our experience. I would think instead the gospel calls me even more deeply to truly engage in the experience and understanding of a person's life or a community's life that's different than my own or our own, and that it's actually my worship that specifically calls me to engage them in an act of concern for truth, mercy, and justice, and I'm wanting to embody that as I engage, even in the moments of intense collision.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask if our panelists want to briefly give a final word to either their interaction here in front or to the questions that have been asked. Either of you want to give a final word for this?
It's kind of heavy burden to do the final word. So maybe a word kind of that motivates and frames these, but also other endeavors, and of which the reality of which what I'm trying to do here is an expression. And that's very much tied to my own sense of the nature of God as a kind of generous love, as revealed in Jesus Christ. And once you put it in those terms, generosity of God as revealed in Jesus Christ, it would seem to me that you can robustly affirm your own convictions and yet do so without begrudging others to have something that's similar to what you have, or sometimes the same, or sometimes even better. Because you can then see how it is on account of this generous God revealed in Jesus Christ that whoever has anything that's good has that which is good just because of that relationship that he or she has to Jesus Christ, or rather put differently, on account of the relationship which God, as revealed in Jesus Christ, has to them, even if they might not know that. That opens up the possibility of generosity without danger of sacrificing any of the deep convictions that we hold. And if anything guides my engagement with world faiths, it's this type of conviction, which I think is the beauty of the Christian faith.
I love that response, and my final word would simply be to say that that would be a vision that I would want to affirm, and that in my role as president at Fuller, and I think about the task that we have of shaping future leaders of the church, it's toward the end that we are forming people who have the capacity to exercise that sort of response to an affirmation of faith and a deep generosity of our spirit in response to the generosity of God in Jesus Christ. That would be a remarkable thing if the hallmark of our life as a seminary was the formation of people who went out to live and lead in ways that reflected that kind of spirit. That would be to be making a remarkable contribution. And it's needed in this domain, but it's needed in many other domains of topics that we could also turn to. And that seems to me to be almost a particularly fitting end to this part of our discussion, as though it is almost like a charge for what we as an institution are really committed to doing.
Thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists.